Hi, good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I am beyond thrilled to welcome you to an excellent conversation tonight between Professor Carol Anderson and Professor Heather Cox Richardson. Thank you for attending. FAN is a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, among others. We have over 125 videos of past events archived on our website and our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for formal introductions. Carol Anderson, the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University, is a nationally recognized historian, educator, and author whose research and teaching focus on the ways that policy is made and unmade, how racial inequality and racism affect that process and outcome, and how those who have taken the brunt of those laws, executive orders, and directives have worked to shape, counter, undermine, reframe, and when necessary, dismantle the legal and political edifice used to limit their rights and humanity. Professor Anderson's latest book is The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. Previous books include One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, long listed for the National Book Award and a finalist for the Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award, and White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Nation's Divide, a New York Times bestseller and winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. Heather Cox Richardson is professor of history at Boston College and an expert on American political and economic history. She is the author of 6 books on American politics, including most recently, How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. Professor Richardson is the author of Letters from an American, a nightly Substack newsletter chronicling current events. She is also the co-host of a new podcast, Now and Then, with historian Joanne Freeman of Yale University. And now, with no further ado, let's welcome Professor Carol Anderson and Professor Heather Cox Richardson.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Carol. It's always such a pleasure to get to work together and to highlight, as we just heard, this incredible new book. So first of all, congratulations on this.
Thank you.
And I'm so impressed that it took you like a minute and a half to write it.
Yeah, right. A long minute. Woo.
So let's take a trip through this just wonderful book, and start by talking about what is the history of the Second Amendment. People always ask, what's a regulated militia, a well-regulated militia, and all that. Can you just give us a nutshell of what we're dealing here with the Second?
The militia that we're talking about, we've got this narrative of the militia now that are this group that fought off the British and are there to end domestic tyranny or to ward off domestic tyranny. But really what the militia was at this time that they really understood was a fighting force designed to quell slave uprisings, to keep the enslaved subjugated, to keep them from running and fighting for their own freedom. That was the role of the militia.
Well, can you talk a little bit about how that ended up in the Constitution? Because in this book, that's a really fascinating thing.
Yes, and so at the Constitutional Convention, James Madison, who was like the architect of the Constitution, wrote in the language about how the federal government would control the militia. And that was because the militia had been just really unreliable during the War for Independence, just unreliable. George Washington was beside himself. He was like, my kingdom for a decent militia. And so he just, and you also had the Banquo's ghost of Shays Rebellion hovering over the Constitutional Convention, which was when you had a group of white men who took on the Massachusetts government in this uprising over taxation and the seizure of land. And the militia, they wouldn't go fight them. And if they would go, they would join them. And so the Boston merchants had to hire a mercenary army to take on the Shays Rebellion and keep it down. And so you had in the Constitution language about that the federal government had the power to organize and arm the militia. Well, South Carolina thought, oh, that's good. We're going to have some more folks come down here when we have another slave uprising. This is going to be great. We're going to get some help. Patrick Henry, whoo, and George Mason, they looked at that and went, oh, Shaggy. They saw just danger coming down the pike because as far as they were concerned, you couldn't trust the federal government. It had those folks like from Pennsylvania and from like Massachusetts, those folks who, as Patrick Henry said, the North detests slavery. And so do you think they would actually come down, send the militia down when our enslaved have an uprising? We are going to be left defenseless. And that battle in the Virginia ratification convention was what, made James Madison just sit up and go, uh-oh, this thing is getting ready to go off the rails. We're getting ready to have a new constitutional convention, and that's going to send us back to the Articles of Confederation. I need to listen. And what he needed to listen to was that need for a militia and a Bill of Rights.
And so the second comes out of that, the idea that they need to have their own state-based militias to go ahead and protect enslavement in the southern states. Is that right?
Yes. That need to protect whites from the fear of a Black uprising was bedrock foundational for the Second Amendment.
So when do we really start talking about the second as a really political thing? Nowadays, it feels like everyone is trying to defend the second with AR-15s. And yet, until the 1980s, it wasn't really that big a deal. Did we think about it since the founding in the terms that we've got it now?
No, in fact, over time, so you had a moment after the Civil War when African Americans are faced with disarmament by these paramilitary groups during the Black codes, and Black folks are hollering, we've got our Second Amendment rights. You have again in the 1930s when the federal government passes a law banning like submachine guns, and a guy goes to court going, hey, I've got my Second Amendment rights. And they said, nah, that doesn't count. Submachine guns or sawed-off shotguns are not part of a well-regulated militia. So, but what we see is in the 1980s, we start getting really the politicization of the NRA and the crafting of the narrative of the Second Amendment as foundational to citizenship and foundational in terms of the individual right to bear arms.
And as Justice Scalia turns out to be very important to that, right?
Yes, and so you end up in 2008 getting the Heller decision. The Heller decision comes out of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. had strict gun control laws because they were trying to clamp down on the massive violence that was happening there. And so, but the Heller decision said that foundational, the originalists went back to what they said was the original intent of the Second Amendment, which was that you had the foundational right to self-defense. And that right to self-defense meant that you had the individual right to bear arms. And so that became the new interpretation of the Second Amendment coming out of the Heller decision with this individual right to bear arms, this individual right to self-defense.
Which were actually made up, right? That wasn't what they were talking about back with James Madison, right?
No. And we know that's not what they were talking about with James Madison, because when Madison drafted the initial Second Amendment, this initial amendment, and it said you have the right to a well-regulated militia. Also in that initial draft was, if you are a conscientious objector, if you are scrupulously, religiously opposed to serving in a militia, then you don't have to. So it really was about this larger militia that was driving this.
So I want to get back to this, to the thesis that you're arguing here and sort of the facts, but now I have to ask, did you actually get to see the piece of paper that James Madison wrote that on?
Oh, I wish I had. No, I wish I had.
How do you?
I saw versions of it written in several incredible books that were looking at this, and they were talking about the first Congress, because that's when the Bill of Rights was being drafted, during that first Congress.
Oh, I was all excited there at the idea that you got to see something James Madison had actually written. I assume it exists, right? So how does I'm going to incorporate some questions people have asked about the history of the Second Amendment, which is, you're saying, really has changed its meaning in the present pretty dramatically. But what about things like the Mulford Act? Would such a strategy like the one that's encapsulated in the Mulford Act be useful today in trying to put some kind of controls on firearms?
Well, and this is the thing, that Mulford Act, that emerged in the late 1960s, 1967 in California. California had open carry laws, and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was using those open carry laws to basically police the police, because police brutality was just raining down on that Black community with absolutely no accountability. And so the Black Panthers knew what the law was. And they also knew how far they had to stay away from the police while watching an arrest. Well, the police didn't like this. And so they ran to Don Mulford, a California assemblyman, to say, hey, we need some help here. Everything that the Panthers are doing with their guns is legal. I mean, they're carrying like legal guns, and then they're carrying them openly, and they're not pointing them at anybody, and they don't have a barrel, it's not loaded. The bullet is not right there in the chamber, just ready to go. Every time we pull them over, we can't arrest them because what they're doing is legal. We don't like what they're doing. We need you to help us make them illegal. And so that's what the Mulford Act does. And it was drafted by Mulford, but as well by a representative of the NRA, and eagerly signed by Ronald Reagan. Now, what Mulford said was, this isn't pointed at any racial group at all. This is about all of those extremist groups like the Klan and like the Minutemen. But the Klan and the Minutemen were not running around California openly carrying weapons. They were violent, to be sure, but that was not part of their strategy. When you look at the letters that Mulford was writing during this time, it's clear that this is targeted at the Black Panthers. And so that's one of the things we have to be really cognizant of when we're talking about gun safety laws, is how they are targeted. What communities they leave vulnerable, and what the issue is that is not being addressed. In California, it was the issue of massive police brutality that was not being addressed, that led to the rise of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense.
So let me interrupt you and ask you first to tell us what was in that Mulford Act, and then I think it's a really good segue to where I want to go next.
Okay, so what was in that Mulford Act was a series of definitions of the types of weapons that could not be openly carried, and it was defining what that meant, because then there were questions of like, well, what about hunters? I mean, if hunters, if you're at your house and then you want to go hunt, you got to have your gun with you. So what about that? So the NRA was helping to draft the language so that hunters could carry their guns from their homes into the woods where they were hunting. And it dealt with where your bullets were in your chambers. So that, what does a loaded weapon mean? So it had those kinds of definitions in there. And that's what the Mulford Act did. It basically said that as the Panthers were coming around with their 45s, with their guns, not sawed-off shotguns, but with their guns, that they were now being cast as illegal, that this was an illegal activity.
All right, well, this brings up the next thing that I found really surprising about your book, which, by the way, I read every word of, which is a big deal. For those of us who read a lot, we tend to skim. I did not skim your book. I read every word of it. I'm sitting in my chair, curled up, thinking, I've got to get to work. I've got to get to work. I've got to get to work. But one of the things that then jumps out is that what you have just laid out for us is a very clear history of a constitutional amendment. But then you lay out a number of really wonderful stories. And I would like first, and then we're going to get to what those stories say, but I'd love it if you would share with us some of the stories that jumped out to you as you wrote this book. And of course, you're like the genius at stories. So your stories are very good.
Oh, thank you. So there were several that really jumped out at me. One was the Battle of Christiana that came after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Because here, you know, what was clear coming through was that this ability for self-defense, this right for self-defense, was not available to Black folk. But that Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had just ticked off the North 8 ways to Sunday. They hated the Fugitive Slave Act because what it did was it made them absolutely complicit in slavery. They were compelled to participate in slave catching in terms of providing the personnel. If they refused to provide the personnel, then they had to pay the enslaver the price for his or her property. It just stuck in the craw. And so in Christiana, in Christiana, Pennsylvania, you had a slave owner named Edward Gorsuch from Maryland coming up to Christiana with his son, his nephew, and a U.S. Marshal to get his property. He had 4 fugitive slaves who had run away from him, and he was coming to get his property. And they come up to William Parker's house, and William Parker is a fugitive slave himself. And they bang on the door, and Parker's like, "Yeah, what do you want?" And Gorsuch is like, "I've come to get my property." And Parker was like, "You see that chair over there? That's not yours. You don't have any property here." And so here you hear this kind of defiance in terms of recognizing, of honoring the humanity of people, that they are not property. And it gets really intense, lots of back and forth. Gorsuch is like, "I'm coming to get what's mine." And Parker is like, "I'm gonna tell you what, old man, you can come up those steps, but once you're up there, you're mine. You're not coming back down again." And that kind of defiance from a Black man talking to a plantation owner was just anathema. And that community had set up a self-defense community. Parker's wife begins blowing the bugle, letting as the alarm sound for the defense community to come. 80 Black folk come just with pitchforks, with pistols, with knives, with farm implements. The U.S. Marshal looks and he's like, "Uh-oh," and he takes off running. Gorsuch is like, no, I'm not leaving here without my property." Well, Gorsuch is killed. Gorsuch is killed, and his nephew and son are severely wounded. Parker and the 4 men then flee up to Rochester, New York, to Frederick Douglass's house. And Douglass says, "I heard what happened down there in Pennsylvania. Let me get you. Let me get you out of here and get you up to Canada." Got them on a boat with 15 minutes to go. And Parker hands Frederick Douglass Gorsuch's gun that he had taken out of that man's dead hands, right? Gorsuch's gun, and Douglass calls it his most prized possession. But what became fascinating for me in this, not only was the self-defense community and the Frederick Douglass angle, but that when there is a trial, and it is a trial for treason. So violating the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is treasonous. And in this trial for treason, the prosecutor's like, "We know the law is obnoxious. We know it, but they violated it. They knew it and they violated it." Well, the judge's instructions to the jury was like, "This is about self-defense. This is about these kidnappers come up here and they don't care whether they're taking the free or the enslaved, and they're just yanking them, kidnapping them, destroying their homes, yanking them back down into the South. That's what's going on here. The jury found those who were on trial not guilty. No one was found guilty for Gorsuch's murder. And so I looked at this because this looks like it is this kind of abrupt fissure that, Black folks do have the right to self-defense. But what we're really seeing is interest convergence here, where the interest of the North in just defying this federal law converged with Black folks' demands to be free. And that interest convergence then is what allowed that community to fight for self-defense. When you don't have that interest convergence, really bad things happen, like down in Elaine, Arkansas, which is my next story. In Elaine,
I'm going to ask you one question. The trial that you just mentioned, is that held in Pennsylvania or New York?
It is held in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Yes.
But in Elaine, Arkansas now.
Yeah, so in Elaine, Arkansas, that's in 1919. We're in the midst of Red Summer. And Red Summer is this moment after the First World War where white Americans are just infuriated that Black folks think that they have fought to make the world safe for democracy, so that they should have some of that democracy here. In Elaine, Arkansas, you had Black sharecroppers who were working, as they say, from caint to caint and weren't getting paid. They would spend a year working, and cotton prices had soared because of the war. They weren't getting any of those profits. They would work for a year and end up with nothing except debt. And
so, wait a minute, what does from caint to caint mean?
You work from when you can't see the sun until when you can't see the sun anymore. Yes.
All right, so they're not getting anything. Go ahead.
And so they decide to unionize. There's a labor union for sharecroppers. They are organizing to join this labor union. Well, the planters find out about it, and they send a scouting party up to that meeting up at Hoopsburg Church. And the scouting party is there to break up the meeting and shoot up the meeting. Well, the sharecroppers, they had said, if the whites find out about this, they're going to kill us. They're going to kill us all. And so they had sentries put outside on the front porch of the church, scouting, looking for any danger coming. They noticed that car sitting up on the road with the lights out. The next thing you know, there's gunfire. At the end of that gunfire, a white man is killed, another white man is injured. The Black trustee, Kid Collins, who's in that car with them, he runs and he tells the authorities what has happened. When they come, they see a dead white man and they're like, oh, we've got a Black insurgency here. They are here to kill all of the whites in Elaine, Arkansas. And so the lynch mob comes, and the lynch mob is it's like any Black person they see is fair game.
Wait, are they still in the church, or is this the day after?
This is the day after. This is the day after.
Everybody goes home from the church, and this is the day after. Go ahead.
The day after, yes, because after the gunfire that has shot up the church, folks are going home. They're like, whoo, the lynch mob comes, and the lynch mob is just ravaging that Black community. And so as Black folks are hiding in the canebrake, some as they're running free from the canebrake, as the mob is coming, they've got their guns and they're shooting, and 2 white men die in that. What that did was it sent a panic through Arkansas. The governor gets the senators to okay him bringing in the US Army to hunt down Black folk in Elaine, Arkansas. They come in with machine guns that they had used in the war in France. And they bring those machine guns into Elaine, Arkansas. And you read the accounts of how they would just lay low the canebrake. where Black people were hiding with their children, with their families, and just wipe them out. And then they'd move to the next field of vegetation and just lay a barrage of gunfire down. And then they'd move to the next one. It was like, yeah, just cut them down. Just, the governor was bragging, we just cut them down. Close to 800 Black people were killed in Elaine, Arkansas. And the issue was that they just wanted to be paid for their labor. And they had the audacity to organize, and they had the audacity to fight for self-defense. That when somebody was there to shoot up a church, they were there to guard against the shooting up of that church. And for that, massacre.
So this is one of the themes, I think, that comes through the book and is so very powerful, is the idea that the Second Amendment is there to protect, theoretically, self-defense, and yet it's there to protect white self-defense and not Black self-defense. And I wonder if you would walk us through a number, not only of the older stories, but what really jumps out is the more recent stories of African-American, especially men, who are armed and who pay for it.
Yeah. So as you know, in the book, one of the things I carry, I look at the right to self-defense. And in that right to self-defense, we've got, wow. Frankly, one of the most horrific stories for me is the story of Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. Because here you have an unarmed Black teenager who is at home and has gone to a convenience store to get some Skittles and iced tea for during the NBA All-Star break. George Zimmerman, the neighborhood watchman, who has consistently been calling in on suspicious Black men in the neighborhood, sees Trayvon and calls 911 and says, this guy's looking, something's not right here. He's looking really suspicious. These kind, they always get away. And he takes his 9mm out of his car and he begins to follow Trayvon. And the 911 operator says, "Sir, are you following him?" And he's like, "Yeah, yeah." And he's just like, "You need not to do that." He doesn't listen. And instead, what we know is that Trayvon ended up with a bullet in his heart. So in this moment, this is a stand your ground state where you have the right to self-defense. And in this moment, as we saw with the press, is that Trayvon got thuggified, is that he became this really big, Black, scary guy who in a hoodie with gold teeth, who was pommeling on this poor, defenseless George Zimmerman, who had no other recourse but to shoot Trayvon. And George Zimmerman walks. So an adult man with a gun stalking a child walks. Then there's the case of Katherine Johnston, who is the 92-year-old Black woman in Atlanta, Georgia. She's at home late at night. She hears the burglar bars being removed from her house. She is afraid. And so she gets what they call her rusty revolver. And when the door burst open, she shoots. She's 92 years old. She shoots. A barrage of bullets come back at her. It's the police who have broke into her house on a no-knock warrant, looking for drugs and a dealer named Sam, all of which had been, it was a fiction. It was born out of a confession based on planted evidence. I mean, there was just so much wrong in this. But part of what you heard was, well, it was justified because she shot at them. It's in the middle of the night. Burglar bars are being removed. What else do you expect a 92-year-old woman to do when people break into her house? She was trying to defend herself. But
So stand your ground is for white people.
Yes, and we see that in the data. The data are clear. Whites who kill blacks are 10 times more likely to get off with this homicide being justified than blacks who kill whites. We see it where whites who kill blacks have a 281% greater chance of being called justified than when whites kill whites. So Black victims make it justified.
Well, you have another horrific story about a woman who is trying to defend herself against an abusive ex-husband.
Yes, Marissa Alexander. And this case I juxtaposed to the case of Trayvon Martin because Marissa Alexander came first in terms of stand your ground. And this is a woman who had a baby who was 9 days old. And her husband who had a restraining order and had a history of violence, was getting ready to beat her again. He had found some text messages that he didn't like, and so he was coming after her. Those were his words. I was coming after her. She broke away from him, ran to the garage. She said she couldn't get out of the garage, and so her gun was in the car. She got her gun, went back into the house, and put a warning shot in the air to get him to back off. The prosecutor looked at that and said,
So she didn't shoot him, she shot the ceiling.
Yeah, she shot into the wall, but she did not shoot him. He did not have a lick on him. She got charged with, forget what it is, but she got
reckless endangerment.
Yes, something like that. And they said that what happened is that because she went into the garage and came back, her ability to stand your ground dissipated. She had the opportunity to not engage. And I'm thinking here, George Zimmerman had the opportunity to not engage, and he chose to, and that didn't matter. But here, Marissa Alexander, a Black woman who had a history of being a domestic violence victim.
Well, I'm back here with a 9-day-old baby, because once you had a little baby, man, you'd do anything to protect that baby. Anything.
Right. Anything. 9 days old. And so she shot into the wall. They said because she didn't shoot into the ceiling that she was endangering him. She could have hurt him. And that there were children in the house. And so that children in the house also could have been hit when she fired. And I'm looking at this going,
what happened to her?
Oh, she got 20 years in prison. She got convicted with 20 years in prison. The case became this cause celeb, right? We're just like, what? You've got a woman who, there are hospital records where he has beaten her so severely, she's had to be hospitalized. She has a baby that is only 9 days old. He tells the story that he was coming after her and she shot up in the air. So as he said, I wouldn't put my hands on her again. So what was happening there was clear. 20 years.
So what you are outlining here is a story of the history of the Second Amendment, a part of our Constitution, and the ways in which it has been used basically in a way that is, well, I'll let you take it from here. I don't want to steal your thunder on this, because one of the truly brilliant things about this book is that you pick it up, as I did, and you think it's about the Second Amendment, and it is. You tell a number of stories, and I'm going to pull one more out of you that you didn't mention here, but I want to make sure we spend a lot of time on what you're really doing, because at the very end of this murder mystery, if you will forgive me, you have a line that goes something to the effect of, but this really isn't about guns. Do you want to tell us what your book is actually about?
It really is about anti-blackness and its effect on African-American citizenship. And this is what I'm really tracking here. This isn't an anti-gun or a pro-gun book. This is about the fractured citizenship of African Americans. And so by going back to the 17th century and going all the way up to the 21st, I'm able to track what that citizenship looks like, what Black people's rights look like and what I'm finding is that regardless of the legal status, enslaved, free Black, denizen, which is that halfway in between point between being enslaved and being a citizen, to emancipated freed people, to Jim Crow Black, to post-civil rights African American, it is still fractured. I juxtapose this, for instance, with Kyle Rittenhouse, who was the white teenager who went up to Kenosha, Wisconsin, with an illegally acquired gun, rifle, an AR-15, and the police welcome him. We appreciate you guys being here. They offer him water during this protest about the shooting in the back of a Black man, Jacob Blake. And then Kyle Rittenhouse goes and he shoots down 3 people, killing 2 of them, severely wounding a third. As he walks towards the police with his hands up, the police don't even see him because they don't see this white teenager as a threat who's carrying this rifle, who has just gunned down 3 people, not a threat. Juxtapose that to Tamir Rice, who is the 12-year-old boy in Cleveland, Ohio, who is playing alone in a pavilion in a park with a toy gun. Now, granted, the toy gun didn't have the orange tip on it that said, "Hi, I'm a toy." But Ohio is an open carry state. And an open carry state says, as long as you're not threatening anyone as you're openly carrying, you're fine. But the police rolled up, they see Tamir, and they shoot him within 2 seconds. 2 seconds. The police officer says, he was a threat. He was a threat. We were afraid. He was a threat. Kyle Rittenhouse, not a threat. Tamir Rice, a threat.
So how does the Second Amendment identify this difference in white citizenship and Black citizenship in America?
And the way that it does it is I look at that language of the militia. That role of the militia was designed to quash slave revolts. It was designed to quash Black people's rights to be, Black people's rights to their humanity. That militia was the bribe that James Madison wrote in there to mollify the anti-federalists like Patrick Henry and George Mason, so that they wouldn't have another constitutional convention. That bribe, like the 3/5 clause that was in the Constitution, really was about the inhumanity that Black people did not have rights. And that's what that Second Amendment does. So sitting in our Bill of Rights, we have an amendment that is about the right to crush Black people's rights.
And yet, during Reconstruction, of course, Black people started carrying guns, right?
Yes, for self-defense. And one of the things that you saw were the Black codes that came out that were about disarming Black folks after the Civil War. And the anger that there were Black troops there as an occupying army, saying that the bloodshed that was happening, the violence and the turmoil that was happening in this Reconstruction South was happening because of those Black troops. It wasn't because of the Black troops. It was because whites were so angry that they had lost the war, and that Black people now were like, yeah, we're citizens, we have rights. And white Southerners were like, no, you don't. No, you don't, as you laid out in how the South won the Civil War. It was this massive battle that was there. And Black folks were saying, we have our Second Amendment rights. And they knew that if there was disarmament, they would be vulnerable. So one of the things that I continue to lay out in this book is that it is anti-Blackness that creates the precarity of life, Black life, so that when Black folks are armed, they are a threat. When Black folks are unarmed, they're still threatening, but now it makes them vulnerable to violence. I mean, that's the conundrum of anti-Blackness in the United States.
Well, they're a threat because they can protect themselves.
Well, their very being makes them threatening. And when they have guns, they're even more of a threat. And so this is why you keep seeing this push for disarmament, disarmament, disarmament. Because as a threat, then Blackness as the threat, and then guns exponentially add to that threat. So in Knoxville, for instance, during 1919, during Red Summer in 1919, the white community was coming in to just lay low the Black section of town in Knoxville. And Black folks defended themselves with guns. Whites called in the National Guard that came in with machine guns in order to just lay low the Black section of town, because it was like, yes, we were coming to lynch you. We were coming to just, have a pogrom and just destroy your community and as many Black lives as we could. You had the audacity to have guns and fire back. We already saw you as a threat, and that's why we were coming to kill you. And then you had the audacity to have guns, so we brought in more firepower.
So you have a very dramatic conclusion to this book. Is it something that you feel like you should share with readers ahead of time, or should I just tell them they should go buy the book?
Tell them to go buy the book.
I will tell you that I finished the book, and I won't tell you exactly what I wrote to Carol, but I wrote to her that she had written quite a book, and that it was going to be even better known probably than One Person, No Vote, which is itself probably the most important book that came out that year. And then there's White Rage, of course, as well. So there she does have a conclusion that I think is very, very thought-provoking. And actually, ever since I read your book, there's been a lot going on about the second, and the people always say to me, why don't you ever talk about the second? And I'm like, I'm not going to say anything till Carol's book comes out, till Professor Anderson's book comes out, because I'm terrified I will use some of your ideas, but now I can just cite you. So I want to go ahead and throw in here some of the questions that people have asked. But first, I'm going to use my prerogative here and ask you a question about how it was to write this book. So I know that I wrote a number of years ago, 10 years ago or more, I wrote a book about the Wounded Knee Massacre, and I still can't handle that day. I always go silent on the day of that massacre, and I still have nightmares. And I can't imagine writing this book. Are you okay having written this book?
I think I am. I think I am. I think I am. I think I am. Writing this book was so hard. This is the hardest book I've ever had to write. One, because I was immersed in the violence. And I, not only being immersed in the violence, but also being in an era of the COVID-19 pandemic that was wiping Black folks out disproportionately, and being in the midst of the violence raining down on the Black community and seeing the lack of accountability. So there was so much resonating of that history with now that it just made it very difficult.
Do you feel like, in a way, you're the voice for the people who've been killed?
Yes, I see myself when I'm writing this book, was that it was to honor those who believed in America, who fought for it, who believed that they were citizens, who believed in their humanity, and were just slaughtered. To make that clear what that is, what that violence is, what is provoking that violence, and that those lives actually mattered. Those lives, those children, those fathers, those mothers, those sisters, those brothers who were working the land, who had their homes, who had visions and dreams, who imagined what freedom would look like, what equality would look like, what citizenship would look like. Yes, I write for them.
So there are questions about that here. I see what we're doing for time. Somebody has asked, do you think and feel that this whole race, color, inequities, hate, misunderstanding, ignorance, and so on is a matter of the heart, and that people's hearts, until people's hearts are changed, there won't really be any change? Or do you in fact think there are things that we as a society could do collectively that would help mitigate the issues in certain people's hearts?
I think that it is a matter of policy, real policy, and that those policies can lead to a different America, can lead to a much more equitable and fair America. When we don't have equitable policies, when we don't have equitable politicians and policymakers, it helps feed into the resentment, the white racial resentment that creates this zero-sum game, that the only way that African Americans can get will be at whites' expense. Fueling that resentment leads to so much of what we have endured in this nation. So those policies to me are absolutely critical. I think I saw a study today that said when whites join unions with blacks, that in fact white racial resentment goes down. Because, and I think that I hypothesize that part of that is that zero-sum game isn't there anymore, that it is this kind of collective, we are building something powerful and wonderful together that benefits all of us. I think that that's key.
There's some amazing studies too about college roommates, and what difference, and I don't have them off the top of my head like you do, so I'm not going to quote from them, but that having biracial college dorms and black and white roommates together dramatically changes the rooming choices people make for the rest of their time in school, which is interesting. So I've got a couple more questions here. Let me see a good one here. Can you address the NRA's efforts to pass what they call constitutional carry in all states? And then there's a follow-up. And then why do the state's residents pretend surprise at mass shootings when that happens in those states?
Okay, so I'm going to start with one of the NRA's big laws, which was Stand Your Ground. This is an NRA baby. Launched first in Florida, and then it metastasized with the help of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, throughout the United States. Stand Your Ground says that wherever you have a right to be, you have a right to self-defense. So it is a massive expansion on the castle doctrine. So if somebody came into your home, your castle, then you had the right to self-defense. Stand Your Ground expands those barriers, that wall from your house. So if I'm in the parking lot, if I'm in the street, if I'm in a park, I've got the right to stand my ground. And it deals with a perceived threat. Well, when Black is the default threat in American society, this is what leads to that disparity that we're seeing in Stand Your Ground cases. 10 times more, where whites who kill Blacks are 10 times more likely to be found justifiable homicide than when Blacks kill whites. Now, take that to this, I love the language and masters of language, constitutional carry, well-regulated militia, a slave patrol, that basically says it's like guns everywhere. And that what that does is when you think about a society that is that armed and a society that does not trust and that has these default threat fear mechanisms built in, it is a disaster waiting to happen. If you think it's bad now, And one of the things that I argued in, I just had an op-ed in The Guardian. And one of the things that I argued is that we've got this convergence of twin pandemics, mass shooting and anti-blackness. And that fear of Black people has been absolutely important in hindering gun safety laws, because there's that fear that if I don't have my gun, then I am going to be left defenseless against the horde of Black people who are going to come in and take my stuff, take my life, take my property. Jonathan Metzl's book, Dying for Whiteness, does a beautiful job of laying out this fear of Black people and the grip of the gun on in that fear that this horde will come in and take this horde from St. Louis will come in and take everything that I have. All that I have is my gun to defend me, to protect me. And so, yeah, this is bad news.
I'm going to hit you with two more questions. One is, how do you respond to people who point to gun deaths in poor Black neighborhoods as a way to delegitimize the Black Lives Matter movement? Is that too long a question for the end here?
No. In fact, one of the things that becomes almost like a knee-jerk response is to say, well, Chicago. Well, and to hone in on the deaths of Black folk in Chicago as this violent space and talk about Black on Black crime. Well, what we don't say is that, yes, over 80% of African Americans are killed by African Americans. Over 80% of whites are killed by whites, but we don't talk about white on white crime. So part of what is in that narrative is the narrative of Black pathology. It is the narrative that there is just something inherently violent and wrong with Black people. Look at them killing each other like this. And what we see in those communities is that we see the incredible work being done trying to stop the violence, trying to provide support mechanisms underneath folks so that they have a way to actually live, trying to find a way to create disengagement activities so that de-escalation activities. All of that is happening, but you don't hear that. Instead, what you get is this veneer that Black people don't care about Black lives. Look at how they're killing each other, and look, they don't even care. None of that is true. Black folks care deeply.
So one final question for you before we wrap it up, because I can see that our time is coming to an end here. What can the average person do to make things better?
I think that I love that question. It is really knowing our history. Knowing our history is so important because it means that we don't get sucked into these myths that are getting constructed to continue to build the fissures in this society. It means that when we hear, our God-given Second Amendment right, we know what that actually really means. And we push back on it, that we want a truly multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, vibrant democracy. It means that we need to reconceptualize in our communities, in our homes, what safety and security really looks like. Because the way we're doing it now, it means that we're not safe in our schools. We're not safe in our churches. We're not safe in our grocery stores. We're not safe in our cars. The way that we're doing it now has been absolutely fundamentally unhealthy and dangerous. So it means that we take control of our history. We take control of our policies, and we hold our policymakers and politicians accountable for the policies that they're putting in place that put us in the crosshairs.
I'm gonna
I could
sorry.
go all night. Congratulations on this wonderful book. I hope everybody gets a chance to look at it, and very best of luck to you with this great book, Professor Anderson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richardson.
Professor Richardson, it was a really fabulous interview. Really appreciate. I know such great learning and teaching that happened in the last 60 minutes. Thank you both so much for that. A reminder to folks, we are doing after hours. We'll be starting at about 8:05. We're going to give Professor Anderson a nice 5-minute bio break to grab a glass of water and get herself ready. Keep in mind, you can continue this conversation, buy a copy of the book. We've been putting the links in chat. Grab a copy of the book, come join us, come ask your questions. I'm gonna maybe tune us back out at 8 o'clock. So you got about 3 minutes. So Professor Anderson, there's a couple questions that came in live during the event. I want to pose one to you that maybe we can get in the 2 minutes you have remaining. Marcus asks, what gives you hope now today? What gives you hope?
I love that. What gives me hope as a historian, as somebody who is engaged today, is seeing how people fight for a better America. That fight, that refusal to accept subjugation, that refusal to accept inequality, that refusal to accept debasement, that is part of our long history, and it's what we're seeing today in this level of engagement. That's where the hope is that the imagination, the vision of a truly vibrant America has not been destroyed. That people fight for it, they organize for it, they mobilize for it, they vote for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Heather, how about you? You seeing any spots of hope anywhere? What's giving you hope right now as you're entering summer?
I'm going to say exactly what Professor Anderson just said. People care. You know, I think she would back me up that 20 years ago, nobody cared about our history and everybody sort of bubbled along. And now people are saying, wait a minute, what did that congressional committee just do? And, you know, and I think Carol would be the first to say that we are not in a brand new period where African Americans are dying at huge rates at the hands, especially of police officers, but people care now, you know, it's making the news. And, you know, you have to have faith in American democracy and in the concept of human self-determination. I continue to do that thanks to people like you and Professor Anderson and the people who are here listening and trying to make the world a better place.
Yes.
Well, thank you for that note. What a great note to go out on. So it's 8 o'clock. Thank you everyone for coming. Professor Richardson, it's been a pleasure to just spend this little bit of time with you. We're big fans of you. So I'm glad that you're in part of the fan family now. Everyone, thank you for showing up.